Okay, well, welcome everyone here uh, in the room with us, and those of you who may be following us on our YouTube channel, in our Gojo series for this year. My name is Luca Somigli. I am the interim chair of the Department of Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies. Although all of you know me as also the former chair of Italian Studies, and so the Gojo lecture series and Gojo events are part of our continuing and engagement with Italian culture, probably broadly understood. That hasn't changed in our transition to the new unit. It's a real pleasure to welcome our guests today, because they're not really guests, they're both associated with our department. I will start with the person at my far right, Alessio Parrinello, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow in Italian studies and has been working on comics and graphic novels for some time. And the person at the center of the table and of our attention is Alessio Aletta, who is now Doctor of Italian Studies. He was defended recently and is now officially anointed doctor, and also the editor of a very important, groundbreaking collection of essays in 2 volumes. I might as well put them up here for everyone to see. These 2 volumes, Italian comics in the new Millennium, which is sort of what what our conversation will revolve, at least will start to revolve around. I'm glad that we could do this, both because it's always a pleasure to welcome back our former graduate students who have gone to do bigger and better things, to acknowledge their current work, their contribution to Italian studies, both here and beyond. But also because I think in many ways these 2 volumes have very much a sort of a U of T sort of tinge, if you will. 2 of the contributors, Alicia herself, one of the Manuela Di Franco, also a postdoctoral fellow in the department 4 years ago, are contributors to the volume. And only because very kindly Alessio asked his then thesis director, myself, I have contributed a small preface to the volume, so there's a lot of U of T behind it. And I think in part that's also, it grows out of the Toronto Italian Comic Studies research group that Alessio, myself and Manuela founded a few years ago, into which a number of other people that have been connected with U of T, like Alice, have contributed. So that's kind of the context for this conversation, and I will start with a question for Alessio, and from there we can perhaps open up the discussion among us, but also with you, the audience here, and if anyone online has questions or if you want to pose, they're more than welcome to do so. But to start, I would like to ask Alessio to tell us a bit more about these 2 volumes, both in terms of how they came to be. I mean, every book begins with some kind of project, some kind of vision. So what that initial sort of point of departure might have been, And how, what guided the process of selection? What are some of the, sort of also some of the results that, or some of the trends, some of the ideas that out of the essays that he has collected?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, basically the process of the creation, so to speak, of these two volumes falls squarely during my tenure as a PhD student here in Toronto, because the first, like the inception phase of these two volumes was a panel I organized at the NEMLA conference in 2020, so 5 years ago, so basically in my third year as a PhD student in Toronto, which I remember very clearly because it was March 2020, so it was just before the COVID lockdown hit North America. And that's actually when I met Alice too, so she's been here from the very start, so I'm very glad that she is standing beside me at this point. And so basically I organized this panel, and I selected 4 speakers for that first panel. Among the sponsors of NEMLA in 2020 were Vernon Press, the publishing house, which after the conference basically got in touch with me and asked if I would be interested in developing that panel into an edited collection. Of course, I was very thrilled to do that. So I opened a call for chapters around the end of 2020. And I was very surprised to receive more than 20 proposals for chapters. So basically, this volume came to be spontaneously because I didn't really expect to get that much attention with this project. And so this is actually very encouraging to me because it was like proof that there were a lot of people who were interested in this theme who maybe did not have that many venues to, express their academic interest in the topic of Italian comics, and in particular of contemporary Italian comics. So this was really a collective effort, and of course Tix, who was born in the process, was very, very much a big part of it, and so I really have to acknowledge Tix, Toronto Italian Comic Studies, for accompanying this project. Another very important research is SNIF, Studying and Investigating Fumetti, which is more like based in Europe, and a lot of members of SNIF were also very supportive of this project. So basically these 2 volumes see the contribution of at least 2 academic communities who in recent years have kind of flourished around the subject of comics studies, of Italian comic studies. About the structuring of these 2 volumes, again, there were a lot of valuable proposals, so hence the idea to split these collection into volumes. And looking at what chapters proposals I got, to me the 2 major themes that made sense to structure this collection were continuity and new trends. The subject of today's talk, of today's conversation, is new trends in Italian comics, but there is of course also an element of continuity. Italian comics is one of the biggest comics tradition in the world, although it does not get acknowledged much in a global context. But even speaking simply about numbers, and it's difficult to give exact numbers, but Italy will be perhaps the 3rd or 4th greatest producer of comics in the world, following, of course, the US, Japan, and of course the French and Belgian traditions. but comparable, I think, to the Belgian French traditions, actually. So around the year 2000, which of course is kind of a symbolic watershed, there are several factors which contribute to a shift in production of comics worldwide and Italy in particular, and maybe we can then talk a little bit about some of those factors. But the first volume idea, so continuity and innovation, is to see how some of the behemoths of Italian comics try to reinvent themselves in this new environment. So we have Sergio Bonelli, so the publisher of Tex and Dylan Dog, just to name a few. We have Disney Italia, so which is actually the biggest producer of Disney comics. Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck are seen more as mascots in the US, but in Italy they are very much, beloved and still productive characters. And of course we have the tradition of so-called fumetto d'autore, authorial comics, so we can establish a lineage from the like of Andrea Pacienza, one of the greatest figure of underground and counterculture comics, to Zero Calcare and Fumetti Brutti and all these very exciting new artists we are seeing. So Zero Calcare is actually the final chapter, the one that I personally wrote to conclude the volume, but it might as well be in the beginning of the second volume, which is called New Scenarios, New Forms, New Themes, and which kind of tries to more specifically look at what is new in Italian comics. So here too I identified a couple of subsections. So the first major subsection is about the debate in person or online, which is very poignant for this meeting, which is hybrid. But of course, perhaps the most visible revolution in the production of comics and in the fruition of comics is the advent of so-called digital comics. So how does a media which was born and raised on paper interface with this new media environment? How does it survive? How does it evolve, adapt, both in terms of creation and in terms of economical viability, so to speak? And of course, the second part of the volume is about trends and case studies in contemporary comics. So this is more about what stories do these comics tell, and there will be several, of course, trends, and actually wrote a chapter entitled A Queer Trend in Italian Graphic Novels, so maybe just as a case study she can talk a little bit about that. But what I think is most striking is this relationship between so comics trying to relate with the depiction of reality and the depiction of personal stories and histories. So the issues of autobiography, autofiction, and of course post-memories, so how we tell our own stories and the stories that are passed to us, and how comics specifically try to do that. And there are elements that comics as a medium does that are not possible in other media. And in Italian comics in particular, we see a lot of very interesting experimentation with that kind of possibilities that this specific medium offers. So this is kind of a very roundabout and maybe somewhat abstract way of posing this what this project is about. Again, maybe Alicia wants to add something about her specific chapter, and also if you have some considerations about this, since of course again you were there from the start, you have as much as a title as me.
Yeah. Thank you, Alessio. I have a couple of questions, but maybe I can start by introducing my chapter and then we can continue. So I wrote a chapter on sort of queer representation in graphic novels in Italy. And to get to the gist of it, it was based on a podcast that I produced during my PhD that was interview-based. So I interviewed 10 different graphic novelists about their work, how they viewed queer representation in Italy in general, and how did they try to work in an environment that was sort of expanding at the time. And this, we'll touch upon this a bit later. And the idea was to interview them in a specific moment in time, which was 2021, 2022, at the time of the DDL Zan discussion, if you remember. I felt the need to sort of understand how culture was representing the LGBTQA+ community at a moment in which, you know, in discussions about LGBTQA+ focused violence was widely present in Italian newspapers and stuff. And what I found out was that, at least in sort of my own personal understanding, is that, like Alessio was saying, actually, graphic novels allow much more experimentation than potentially literary fiction at this very moment, at least in Italy. Because if we look at literary fiction, we sort of have the new names that are emerging are sort of follow similar trends. We have autobiographical narratives, which are also present in graphic novels, but I feel like at least the genre of graphic novels allows for a more diversification, not just in terms of who is allowed to speak, but also the way that they do. For instance, one of the artists that I worked on with what he calls a sort of graphic anarchy. So they do a lot of work in sort of undoing the sort of also artistic techniques that they were taught. For instance, if they went to an Accademia di Belle Arti, sort of trying to unlearn what they learned and sort of create a new way of expressing themselves. So my idea is was to sort of understand what I call a trend in Italian graphic novels, because I do believe that there's, again, greater space for experimentation at this very moment, at least, than in other, perhaps, genres in Italy. But like I'm discussing just now, I feel like the project, in my understanding, was sort of based on a very specific political situation, that is the years between 2015 and maybe 2020, which, if we look at the more sort of text, there was a more openness. Well, obviously, the last few years have, I don't know, had a sort of slight shift towards right-wing and far-right policies. I think maybe, but this is all very like sort of initial research that I've been doing here, has had a consequence on the representation and in the production of queer graphic novels in Italy. So if there was a brief moment of openness and development, I feel like now that's sort of, there's like less and less works that have been published. But at the same time, if these works are not published in sort of traditional publishing companies, graphic novelists are instead moving towards the digital. So they refuse to, not refuse, but yeah, it's not like they are sort of marginalized by publishing companies. They themselves decide to move towards the digital and sort of do not express themselves through traditional media, but to either engage using social media, for instance, Instagram, or also platforms such as Patreon, and sort of try to build a community and move towards the digital space. And I feel like there's sort of, at least if we look at queer representation in graphic novels, is sort of the main shifts that I'm seeing, if that makes sense, if it was not too rambling. But I sort of have a follow-up question based on this, which is one of the things that I've been sort of thinking about. And you mentioned Fumetti Brutti, also in the introduction to the second volume, if I'm not mistaken, as sort of one of the main representatives of Italian graphic novels today, aside Zero Calcare. Why do you think she especially has, you know, gained such a popularity? Because looking at all these other authors, she's the one that, I don't know, like, published several comics with Feltrinelli Comics. Now she collaborates with La Repubblica, which is obviously like other authors are self-publishing more and have moved online, while obviously she's instead juggling and moving in a more mainstream.
Sorry, jump in, but maybe you want to say a couple of things for those in our present or virtual audience about Feti Brutti and say more about who she is, and, what she does, and so do you have a word?
So basically, Fumetti Brutti is a trans comics artist from Sicily, I guess Catania, if I remember correctly. She emerged, like 6 years, I think, now. At first, I guess, on Instagram. So she is one of these, so she embodies also this trend of artists who start building a web following. And then she she was able to kind of leverage that following into getting published with a prestigious and also at the time new press, which was Feltrinelli Comics, so one of the major publishers in Italy who was starting to get interested in publishing, I guess we can call it graphic novels, or comic books anyway. And she wrote 3 comics at first, which followed what she called the trilogia esplicita, so explicit trilogy, with comics that were very much expressing her journey, her relationship with sex, and her own transition. So the first comic was Romanzo Esplicito, so explicit novel. It was kind of an autofiction novel, graphic novel about her, relationship with sex. The second one, P, la mia adolescenza trans, adolescence. It was about her transition, essentially, or how she came to her transition. And the third one, Anesthesia, was about her gender affirming surgery. And all 3 of these comics were hugely successful, both in critical terms and also among the public. Then she wrote others, but this is where her trajectory kind of started. And there are several things that are interesting about her as a case study. And I mentioned there in the introduction of the second volume. First of all, because I was hoping to receive some chapters proposal explicitly about Fumetti Brutti, because I think she is a very pivotal figure in the current comics Italian mediascape. Second of all, because she really embodies this urge to, break with tradition, something new in many aspects, and also because, again, of her own lived experience as a trans woman, of course. But even in her style, Fumetti Brutti has, first of all, the name Fumetti translates to ugly comics. It is kind of a tongue-in-cheek pen name, because I think she mentioned in interviews that she's actually very confident here in her drawing. But her style is very pop in a way. It's very pop art. It's very essential, and there is this very stark use of colors. Most of her production tends to play with 1 or 2 primary colors. So each chapter of the Trilogia Esplicita, for instance, has one specific color. So the first one is red, the second is yellow, the third one is blue. So she embraces this kind of new aesthetic, which I think resonates a lot with modern audiences. So one stylistic trend I think we can see in modern comics, for instance, is this tendency towards simplification, very hyper-stylized trait, in contrast with an urge to or a drive towards realistic drawing, which was more characteristic of, I think, the Bonelli tradition, for instance. And again, this perceived sincerity, her own, self-representation, essentially. So she resonated because her style is very, her drawing style is accessible, very simple, and her narrative style is perceived very authentic. And so she really is, I think, a disruptive figure in Italian comics, and she embodies better than other artists, I think, a tendency which is more widespread. It's not only, it is very much her own style, but it is also something we can see to different degrees in other authors. So that's why I think she's a very symbolic figure of this transformation into this revolution in Italian comics. I don't know if you agree with that.
No, I completely agree, especially because out of the 10 people that I interviewed 4 years ago, she was unfortunately excluded, but not because I didn't want her. She's the one that sort of then, well, first of all, embodied this one trend of finding authors on Instagram and social media, but she's also the one that then stayed. So I feel like many others were maybe then published, they had their first graphic novel published, and sort of did not earn as much as expected, so then that was it. While she then got on to do bigger and better things. And yeah, out of the other 10 people that I've interviewed at the time, maybe 3 are still publishing and others are sort of either changed careers. One of them does stand-up comedy to great success, but nonetheless it's different. And others are sort of resumed to sort of self-publishing or moved online, which I think is also maybe not just connected to global trends, geopolitical trends, but more connected to the fact that obviously being a graphic novelist today varies job.
Yeah.
And out of all the ones that I've interviewed, potentially maybe one only is able to sort of self-sustain himself through drawing graphic novels, while even either have other jobs or they changed careers. Maybe Wolfgang Group is actually one I would assume Zero Pacciare who's actually able to make a living out of this only.
Yeah, she kind of
I feel
demonstrated
like
to
she's
have
fine.
she had staying power, let's say, compared to the others. Yeah, and this is also very, very interesting, that this point you raise about many comics artists, doing comics basically on the side, which is, a part of the discussion of comics in Italy and comics. I don't think it is an Italian problem. That it kind of swept under the rug when we discuss this academically, but it's very important to recognize that comics artist is, for the most part, not a sustainable career. So all of these artists need to have, something else going on. And for many of them, for example, it's illustration. So they kind of do comics to, for their expressive, to express themselves, but in some cases also to get some visibility, and then, maybe have a return in that, people hire them for illustration, for instance. This is also something that is very common and not, so there is some kind of permeability between these scenes, the illustration, the comics production, graphic design. So it is kind of rare to find the comics artist who only does that.
Yeah. Well, what I noticed that I think is going to be interesting maybe in a few years is that some of the people that I worked on now are working on the side as teacher in comics school. And these are the ones that were trying to unlearn the drawing style that they learned when they went to comics school. So I think in a few years it will be interesting to see sort of maybe the result of that. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on if these comic schools are producing a new way of doing comics in Italy, or is it too soon to? But also, I don't know. I really don't know the history of like comics school in Italy. So maybe it's been there for years, and we already see the results of that. But mostly because the people that I've worked on have gone to the Accademia dell'Arte, for instance, and not necessarily
To comic school. Yeah, very interesting question, and I'm not sure I have the answer. I'm not so well documented about the history of comic schools, but yeah, it is something that it is very much, it is a reality that is very active in Italy. I'm not sure how the results differ. So, how much the what they teach in a specific comic school has an influence on this new generation of comics artists that we see flourishing right now. There are for sure some exchanges between these varieties, but I think, yeah, I do think this is something that we will be able to assess in a few years from now. But yeah, I don't know, do you have any?
Well, I think, in the spirit of the continuity and innovation, I think, what we're talking about, what we've been talking about, is on the innovation trend, right? At the same time, then there's the question of continuity and what kind of continuity there is in the current market with the comics that is the comic tradition until quite recently. So the comics that were a form of popular entertainment, that privileged seriality, that were distributed not through bookstores but through news dealers and news agents. And my preface, as you know, but was in many ways, I think I'm probably the oldest contributor to this, which explains a lot. But my contribution was in part about, and this was, as I said, was also a preface, so it wasn't meant. It was more meant to set the stage than to make any rigorous statement. But all that said, was about the this kind of broader shift in not just the distribution of comics, but the distribution of all kinds of printed material. The shift away from, in fact, from print to online information, which in my mind is sort of in my mind finds its symbolic representation in the disappearance of what until not very long ago was a venerable Italian institution, the news dealer, right? Where you would find, you wouldn't just buy comics, you had magazines, newspapers, and all the kind of printed material that was distributed outside of the bookstore circuit. Popular fiction, Gialli Mondadori, Urania, in more recent years, even the classics and not so classic and middle brow through the book series published and distributed through newspapers. And there has been sort of a collapse of that kind of distribution, that kind of material. And the impact on comics, I think, has been that it has further pushed them into this kind of almost elitist kind of production. You have to go find in bookstores, and up until probably very recently, one could, I wouldn't present that talent, but one could make a living with comics, right? You could, when Bonelli had 15 or 20 series at 8, 10, 12 issues a month, that's a lot of people illustrating. That's a lot of people writing stories. So I think that the shift, there's this almost overturning of the traditional, hierarchy where comics were at the bottom of the hierarchy of media, really, not more than genre. And so, you had, of course, the book up here, and then cinema, and then television, and at the very bottom, comics. And now comics have gained legitimacy, but I think at the expense of having become this object that is relegated to the bookstore. It's one thing to, comics are getting expensive in used eras as well, but an issue of text is a lot cheaper than a volume of Zero Calcare volume at 20 to 25. So it's that there is the transformation is one where some things are gained, but other things are lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I very much agree, but I think the one of these one major aspect is that you say comics, but the elephant in the room is the label of graphic novels.
Yeah.
Because
I noticed that Alicia was saying graphic novels.
it's not. Yeah, it's not comics. Being legitimized, but graphic novels.
Right.
Which are, I would argue, essentially the same thing, but in the public perception and in the they are marketed, they are two very different products. So comics, I think, are still regarded as this very lowbrow pop culture thing, whereas graphic novels are nominated for Premio Strega and so on. And again, it's just a matter of perception and a matter of basically that I don't know, I don't remember who said. I think some comics artist said what is a graphic novel is just a comic book with hardcover, which it is pretty true actually. But we see these kind of divarication of the history of comics and the history of graphic novels, which many comics artists, I think, as long as I tell, don't really like the label graphic novels, but publishers really do, of course, because again, you can get comics in bookstores by calling them graphic novels.
But also the switch between one being fumetto and the other graphic novel.
And also, there is this kind of disgust with the word fumetto.
Yeah.
There was this very funny campaign in a very popular bookstore in non chiamateli fumetti, don't call them fumetti, right? And they proposed this kind of, call them graphic novel, manga, of course, nuvole parlanti, which I've never heard someone call a fumetto nuvola parlante. I mean, maybe, but, and also there was the matter of, for instance, the adaptation of Igor's Cinque Numero Perfetto. And Tony Servillo, who starred in the movie, said, Igor's Cinque Numero Perfetto is not fumetto, of course, it's not Topolino. And there's also this other trend of, Mickey Mouse, Topolino, is considered like the lowest lowbrow product you could possibly even imagine. Whereas Topolino is actually one of the most important products in the comics, in the Italian comics landscape, and also a very high quality product in terms of the figures who work at Topolino, the writers, the illustrators, like you have Giorgio Mazzano working on Topolino. So the destiny of the newsstand and the bookshop, and the destiny of comics and graphic novels are to hide to a great degree, I think, intertwined in this kind of, So the comics is losing ground, and the graphic novel is, gaining that ground that the comics have lost. But in doing so, it is kind of mutating in something very hard to define, very hard to assess. I don't know if you think like.
Yeah, but also at the same time, I feel like many, like you were sort of saying, many of the artists sort of dabble in both. It's not like they only, I mean, obviously there's those that only do like standalone graphic novel, but many of them also, again, because of the precarity connected to their job, sort of maybe illustrations for a serialized comic series, but at the same time they do a graphic novel on the side. So I also feel like maybe, yeah, it's just the generalized perception that has changed, but then if you look at the inner workings of it, not necessarily.
Yeah, but also I think that the expectations for a comic book are kind of different versus the expectation for a so-called graphic novel. Even again, as we were saying, in terms of like the style, the artistic style, serialized comics, they tend to follow the trend of continuity. So the Bonelli style, so very realistic drawings, I think, are very much prevalent still in comics, in serialized comics, with a few exceptions. As one argument I heard in defense of the graphic novel label is that graphic novel is kind of seen as the experimental branch. So it's where the artist really can push the boundaries of the medium. And I don't know how much I agree with that, but I think you can make an argument about that. So and I think it's not about the graphic novel, it's about the standalone comic is the one that of course has more creative freedom. Although, I mean, in that sense, you have, for instance, for Dylan Dog, which is one of the biggest serialized comics, you have Dylan Dog Color Fest, which is kind of this, let's say, related magazine, which is not in continuity with the, and it's in colors, but also it's the one in which authors and artists are allowed to experiment more. So even this dichotomy does not really hold up. But yeah, it is a way to kind of diversify, so let's say, the offer, the artistic offer.
I think, graphic novel has worked particularly well as a legitimizing category, right? Legitimizing tool with the problems that involves a number of reasons, including the fact that you go to the graphic novel section of 1590 or whatever, and you find a lot of stuff that was originalized, just because a lot of comics, whatever you want to call it, for it to get repackaged and resold, especially when they're geniuses at reselling volumes over and over. But so there is it's a bit like, although I think probably with kind of a dynamic it's all opposite, but it's the old dichotomy between the novel and genre fiction, right? That comes kind of into being right around the same time as the novel is, especially the realist novel, is legitimized as a legitimate form of artistic expression. You also have the birth of all kinds of popular fiction in magazines and in the pulps and so on, and so you have this opposition between the novel, like with no further definition, and then genre fiction, science fiction, detective fiction, that is supposed to belong to the realm of the popular, and therefore of the artistic, of the entertaining and so on. And it's almost like with comics, it's gone the other way round. First, you had the popular, this popular, almost singularly to popular entertainment, although that's not been the case, if ever, certainly hasn't been the case since the 50s, let's argue. And then you have had this, the graphic novel as the legitimizing tool to suggest that you can have experimental comics, but if you call them comics and you relegate them to, even with the underground comics in the 60s, that it was comics with an X to differentiate them, right, from the, so it's, I always like to remind people that, again, taking advantage of the wisdom of age, the first time that I have seen the word graphic novel was from Marvel, graphic novel #1, The Death of Captain Marvel. I bought it when it came out in 1981. I think that even predates Eisner's what's the patent with God? A contract with God, thank you, which is usually tried as the first graphic novel, and it's in fact not a continuous narrative. As always happens in these categories, they're always already messy, and so. But my sort of long-winded point is that, yeah, I'm very suspicious of the category of graphic novel, because it seems it seems one of those, again, those categories that has the function of establishing, of distinguishing the good from the bad, right? And not to say that you don't need something to distinguish the good from the bad, but it also draws boundaries within what is in essence a medium rather than a genre that has can do all kinds of different things. It carves out these boundaries that I think end up being more problematic than anything else. Not everything that is, a standalone graphic novel is aesthetically or otherwise valuable, and not everything that it comes out, if anything comes out in from these dealers, is necessarily doesn't necessarily belong to their own popular. Does that dynamic, again, the opposition of comics and graphic novels, popular versus elite, does that come out, do you think, from your books?
Again, yes, in a way, of course, it must, because it's one of those unavoidable issues when you talk about contemporary Italian comics. I personally dislike the label graphic novels, and so I made a point of stating that in a footnote in both introductions. But I don't want to impose my own view, so some of the authors who contributed to both volumes do use the label graphic novel. That's fine.
There's an ancillary question: is it masculine or feminine? Is it the
Oh,
yeah.
No, but I don't want to distract
thankfully, the volumes are in English, so we didn't have to deal with that. Personally, if you must use graphic novel in Italian, I would say masculine. Because,
sure, I'll buy it. No.
Because it's romanzo, otherwise la novella grafica. But anyway, one way in which it comes, and also, by the way, I debated with myself whether I ask this, because I think that serialized comics, or just comics versus graphic novels, seems to me to have kind of took over an older dichotomy, which was popular comics versus fumetto d'autore, author's comics, which is one of these other reports that really didn't make sense, but in that case it was more obvious that it didn't make sense, whereas graphic novel seems to be a different, a different object than just fumetti. One way to avoid this issue is, again, to avoid talking about graphic novels. I prefer, in Italian, I say just fumetteria, like it's a comic book that is sold in a bookstore. That's really all there is. But the more objective separation, I think, is serialized versus standalone. So, for instance, in the first issue, which is the one about continuity and innovation, the first part is a serial comics, and that's where you have Italian Disney, you have Sergio Bonelli, and you have Ratman, which is by Leo Ortolani, which is one of the, I guess, most influential works in Italian comics. And it's a case of a fumetto d'autore, which also happens to be serialized in, by in a way, a graphic novel. Although Leo Ortolani, after finishing Ratman, ended up writing several graphic novels or standalone comics. So, as you were saying, they kind of double.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is also, it's also a thing that you will have to keep in mind. So if you have serial comics, then you can talk about comics artists such as GP and Zero Calcare, and of course going back to Andrea Pazienza, and kind of make a difference between that kind of use of the medium versus the use of the medium made by the traditional comic publishers who deal mostly in comics, such as Bonelli. And even then, one interesting initiative that editorial initiative Bonelli took in the last years was to establish several magazines which are dedicated to standalone comics. So you have, for instance, Romanzi a Fumetti, which is another way to avoid these graphic novels. And you have also Bonelli Le Storie, which are standalone stories.
Even something like what are called Dixonia. That's also this kind of in-between thing where you take serial characters, but then repackage them as, especially early on. So I would argue that's, but especially early on, the idea was that you get these leading figures in international comics even interpreting. So it is kind of in between.
Yeah, you have minor
I think,
text and
the point, what you're saying is something that we've always known about categories, is they work until they don't, right? So even that distinction between serialized comics and standalone works very often, but not always, and that's what happens with all the categories we use. And what's his name? Sam, the author of Cerebus, was this sprawling series. Started as a parody of Conan and then became its own thing. But anyway, the point is that he called it a graphic novel in 500 issues. So it's it is kind of stretching the limits of both seriality and authorship.
I was about to say, sort of do a walk of shame. I do use graphic novels, but more to refer to as a working term for a standalone.
I've used it. In fact, I had to. When I realized that probably the although arguments can be made for everything, the preferred gender is masculine for graphic novel. I had to go back and change the gender to at least 5 in something I did recently. So not only have I used graphic novels, but I've used it, but I've also misgendered it. So
no, me too. I realized recently.
That's maybe we can bring in also our patient, small but hopefully interested audience to join the conversation. If you have any questions, comments, anything you'd like to.
Do you like the term graphic novel or?
What do you? Let's do it. Small survey.
Let's do a survey.
Honestly, we can have this conversation again once you've all read the book and taken copious notes. John.
I have a really basic question, and I apologise if this is really stupid, but when you talk about the transition to digital, how do people consume material experience and the sort of beauty and the object, which was I don't know much about it, but obviously was very important for the success of Vernon for so long in Italy. So I wonder if you could say something more about that kind of the practicalities of it, and also the other part of it is how do they draw? This is a very dumb question, I'm sure. How do they draw for digital? Does that change the technique of drawing? Does that change the way it's translated into the other types of materiality? And just an anecdote, I knew when I lived in Milan, I knew loads of people who wrote fumetti, and there was a whole like group of people. And one of my friends, even then, this is we're talking about the 80s, survived by drawing little drawings for the assessed mum made Miss Enemy sticker. That's how he paid the bills. Couldn't make any money from his high level, high culture fumetti, which were amazing, but he didn't make any money from them.
Yeah. Shall I go? And then you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Go for it.
Okay. So about the production comics, from my understanding, it is exceedingly rare right now to find a comics artist who works entirely traditionally. So in some phases of the process, there is the intervention of digital tools, and I think most authors today draw comics with a tablet or something like that. How it changes the final product is a very interesting question, and I'm not sure. Also, these digital tools are meant to imitate the traditional way of drawing. So ideally, the result should be identical. But I think there are differences. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I have a specific author in mind who actually draws fumetti, let's say, in a traditional way, as in with, but they also complained that when they submitted their drawings to the publishing company, then the final result did not properly transfer sort of the vibrancy of the colors then on the finish. So it's interesting how maybe instead producing things digitally, obviously sort of end result is much more similar to what the author had in mind.
Yeah, and about the first part of your question, which is extremely interesting and I think not basic at all, and I have, I think, more to say about that. So, first of all, I don't think that consuming comics digitally is all that on in Italy, unless it's those comics published on Instagram, which is that that specific instance. So what they call Insta comics are very dominant, but traditional comics that are also sold and packaged as e-comics, I don't think that really never took hold in Italy. I think Bonelli experimented with a digital platform, but it closed because it wasn't very successful. There are issues of remediation between digital and comics on print. Let me just auto-promote, not my book, but I did write an article which is open access about Leo Ortolani specifically, about the way that he drew digital comics and then adapted them in a printing form, and it does change. It does change a lot, and it does change depending if we're talking about digital comics on what device you read them. For instance, many publishing houses do publish their comics primarily on print, but you also have the option to buy them for much cheaper as ebooks. In those cases, you are usually meant to read them on a big screen, such as a tablet or a computer, and you do have systems to navigate the comic, because the problem is that the traditional comic page is vertical. Most of our screens are horizontal, unless they're very little screen. So it doesn't translate. So what they do is they have these softwares that allow you to zoom on one panel at a time, which is a very disruptive experience, because then you cannot see the page as a whole, which is what the artist usually has in mind. So that's one problem, and there are also problems, in my opinion, when you translate a digital comic to the printed form. Why? Because digital comics, unless they are conceived with the idea of then having them on print, use what has been called the infinite canva. The infinite canva is basically the idea that you can just scroll through, again, one infinite, very long page, and then you don't have to break it into pages. So it's one continuous scroll, essentially, that allows you much more freedom in how you dispose your sequences. But then you have to print it, so you have to break it down in pages, and it doesn't always work that well. For Instagram comics, you have the opposite problem, because Instagram comics are one panel at a time, and then you put them together to artificially form a page, and also create, translation issues, so to speak. So some authors do employ strategies to account for these problems. In other cases, it's much more automated cases. You can have basically a lesser experience. Like my short answer is, if a comic is conceived as a digital comic, probably the best way to consume it is digitally. If it is conceived to be printed, then printed is usually the best way. Of course, in practical terms, the printed way is the one that makes money. Digital comics make small to zero amounts of money, so it's not as sustainable. And for the consumer point of view, usually, and again, I don't know how scientifically grounded this idea is, but I think most comics consumer are, to some way, much more than it is the case in books, attached to the physical object. They are what we call bibliophiliac, right? So they're the one who really care about having a nice object, which is, in a nice cover, and then you have the variant cover. All these aspects, which is very important for comics collectors, who are a huge bulk of the comics market. This all gets lost in digital comics. So you have this kind of problems too. I don't know.
Yeah, no, well, I wanted to add on my own personal annoyance, reading graphic novel, like ebook, on my laptop, because it does what Alessio was saying, as in like zooms in, but in panels that are automatically divided. So either I can't read properly because then it's too small, or then it's zoomed in, but then I miss the entire page. And then adding on to the digital aspect, some of the people that I've been working on sort of experiment different platforms. Like I was saying, for instance, yes, they use a lot of Instagram, for instance, but also they use Tapas, which is a sort of free platform where one can upload their work, and it's sort of also a kind of endless scroll as well, and it's just meant to be created digitally. Other times you use Patreon, where you have to pay a monthly fee to access the materials, and then you sort of otherwise receive them as a newsletter to your own personal email. So what's interesting to me is like all these different now ways of disseminating one's own work. And it's interesting how some of them do release them still today for free, using these different platforms, but not necessarily, they sort of escaped from the traditional ways of teaching, but then they sort of not making any money at the same time now, or how they're trying to crowdsource instead money through Patreon and other similar platforms, if that makes sense.
I think there are a number of issues here. One,
First of all, the platform is not, platforms are not equivalent, right? So the platform for which a certain comics is being conceived is influence its production. This is not an entirely new problem. Why Bonelli comics are the way they are is that, you know, with that classic 3x2 or 3x3 grid, is that after the war, a lot of comics came out in these booklets, like of the same, about the size of a comic strip, right? And then when they republished them as volumes, then they put strips per page, and so here you have this 3x3 that it's a bit crowded, so then when it became its own sort of format, it ended up being usually a 3x2 grid. But it was a product of this kind of remediation from a certain type of, you know, print format to another. And I think to some extent I agree with Alessio that for readers of comics there's a certain level of fetishism for the comic object. On the other hand, for comics more than for other, you know, forms of printed material, the material form, the material shape is important. A novel, you know, if it's whether it's a large print bound edition or a Kindle, it's words in a sequence, right? But with a comic book or a graphic novel or whatever, it's not just a matter that, as Alessio was saying, if you need to see the page, because otherwise you lose a sense of destructive narrative flow, because the artist thinks, or the authors think in terms of the page, in fact usually two-page sequence, but also that different formats do different things, right? So you can't shrink a comic that was produced in the traditional Italian or French sort of graphic format, which is, you know, about yay big, to an iPad screen, because you can't see a thing. So I think comics are informed by their material support a lot more than other media. It's the same reason, you know, why you can't, if you're going to republish a future, you know, Zantuntum, you have to do an anastatic reproduction. You can't repaginate it because you lose the visual dimension of the text, which is as crucial, if not more, than the words on the text. I mean, I actually, for reasons of research, I got myself a subscription to Marvel Digital. I thought, all the Marvel comics, I'll never leave the house. I haven't really used it because it is a very different way of reading the book. The other thing is that, and I don't know that there have been studies, I mean, both of you would probably know a lot more about this. It would be interesting to see, you know, the sociological studies of who are readers of comics now. And I you know, you might also divide along the comics, graphic novel split. I suspect that, you know, I am, and people not much younger than me, are the target audience of traditional comics. I think a lot of, you know, Bears of Text and Dylan Dog, they're not, you know, 15-year-old, as it might have been the case 30 years ago, but I think there are others of visual entertainment that have taken the place of what might have been a more sort of robust medium as comics, and I think especially for serial comics, nostalgia is a big. It may also depend. I mean, I'm sure that. But I remember actually in one of the essays in here, somebody, well, the author, I can't, looking at Disney comics and talking about how one of the one of the tensions, and I think that we're talking about the last 15 years or so. One of them is how to hold together the audience of the adults who read Topolino out of nostalgia and because that's part of their identity almost. And on the other hand, that also means producing a certain kind of Topolino story, right? And the need to find new audiences, especially in the fact that Topolino is traditionally being targeted to children and young adults. So how finding new ways of reaching new audiences and what that might look like, and that might then make the traditional readers unhappy. So there is that nostalgia is probably stronger. This kind of reader that reads for the, again, let's call it the nostalgia value. I think it's probably a stronger phenomenon in comics than in other. Just like collecting is a stronger phenomenon than is in other media. I mean, I don't think collectors of other than of English modernist novels.
No, yeah, definitely. The question of the target reader of comics is an interesting one. I think that Andrea Tosti, the author of the Disney Italia, you can really tell. I think if you read the recent issue of Today, are struggling with that. Bonelli is doing various solutions in various of their titles. For instance, Dylan Dog, a biggest example of they tried to say current, so they basically revolutionized the whole the whole concept. They tried with a reboot.
How well did that go?
Yeah, I mean, but it was a bold attempt. Let's say so. Whereas Tex is, I think, much more conservative in the way, but they experimented with not Tex, but like Tex Wheeler. They created.
That's it. I think that's the interesting thing. I mean, I was going to say, it was. I won't go into too much nerd territory, but it's interesting that they have almost split text into two. So there's the traditional text that you buy monthly, and then it's always the same story. And there's something reassuring. It's like chicken soup, right? You buy your text, you know where you're going, you just go along, and you feel you're back to when you were 10 and reading it in your parents' house. But then with Tex Wheeler, they're experimenting with more sort of contemporary forms. So the characters are there, and you recognize. So if you are the nostalgic reader, you can still find, Kit Carson, even though his hair is black and not white, and Tex, but in the same structure of the narrative, it's much more sort of, it's much more mosso. There is also a greater attention to continuity. Certainly, the idea that you almost like see it in a TV series, right? So you do an arc, and then you do another one that builds on the one that came before it. A little bit like some of the like a TV series on Netflix. I don't know if that works in terms of bringing in new readers, but interesting way of, and the Marvel has been doing this for years, but it's an interesting attempt to take a legacy character and try to construct narratives that are more in tune with a different media landscape, where the kind of stories that we might access through television, and so on is different.
Yeah, they're trying different things. I think if we are talking about Italian readership and the age of Italian readership of comics, what we must consider is that my sense is that the young Italian readership is turning increasingly not to Italian comics but to imported comics and especially manga. If you go to, again, an Italian bookstore and you go to the fumetti section, you have a lot of graphic novels, but you have twice as much manga. So that's also perhaps why these Italian comics producers invest in keeping the older audience readership, because they don't have to compete as much with with these other products.
And American comics, which are still quite popular. On the whole,
but I think
multimedia.
for sure. But I think manga is by far the most read form of comics.
And it's also present in bookstores as well, which was not before.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Do we have any
other
questions?
So when it comes to the legitimacy of comics, you were saying, what is the role played by the author as a legal category or as an institution? The legitimization of the comics.
The what?
The author. When it comes to the legitimation.
For the legitimization of
the author, as an analytical category. Because if you think about it, Topolino, for instance, I don't think it's connected with the actual, with the person, with the author. As I was saying, as
Okay.
institution.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I think right now increasingly we see author as being important in the comics. So in the original Topolino, you didn't even have the name of the authors of the stories. They came much later. I think the first one was Martina for Topolino, I think. But yeah, traditionally, what sold was the character, not the author. I think right now this is starting to shift, again, because we have this legitimization process of the comics and graphic novel, whatever, as an art form, and it is much more closely associated with the author. And even, I think, this reverberates into serials where many readers pay attention to who is writing and who is drawing the stories they read. So it's not only I want, Dylan Dog, but I want Roberto Recchioni's Dylan Dog, or I really despise Roberto Recchioni's Dylan Dog. I prefer Paola Barbato. So there is a closer association, I think, with the author to the product as as an art. I don't know.
Yeah. No. Also, if we look at standalone comics, there's an interest in self-narratives that I think is very much present. So you have the author talking about their life and also representing themselves within the standalone comic itself. I think there was a special issue that came out last year or 2 years ago of Italian Studies solely dedicated to life narratives in comics. There's a stronger interest, I think, in the author as a character, as the author, and then,
Yeah, and if we think about, the most successful comics artists, we mentioned Fumetti Brutti, Zero Calcare for sure, even GP, they are all authors who have a strong presence in their work. So, yeah.
That brings us back to some extent to that divide, right? The authorial in the Fumetti d'autore or whatever, obviously the autore is much more present, and then with the expansion of comics beyond genre, because again, that has always happened, but the genres to some extent managed to contain that. So, if you're reading Pratt, you're reading Fumetto d'autore, but also recognizably within a certain genre, adventure, comics, and so on. With with the advent of graphic novel, there's also been a greater emphasis on life narratives, on, you know, that's not just parallels the, you know, things that happen also in the novel without graphic. I think that certainly a greater attention to who's making comics being there for some time. The graphic novel trend has certainly emphasized it because, as you say, you know, if you go to the book, if you go to the bookstore, you're looking for a work by, so not necessarily about a certain character. Okay, any other comments or thoughts or questions? I think it is quarter two, so we can. Oh, sure. Go ahead.
So, because you were talking about manga, I'm not an expert of comics or manga, but my perception is that when it comes to manga, you have more kind of a media ecology, the different aspects. It's not just textual, you have all the different kind of production. Do you have something similar in the Italian context or not? Some example that can actually be associated or described as a media ecology than just a tech practice.
Like surrounding Italian comics.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Topolino I think is somehow similar because you have the comics, you have the stories, and then you have a whole different kind of merchandise that is linked to that. But others, I don't know.
Maybe so.
Yeah, Zero Calcare has some of that. Yeah, it's the only example that comes to mind. You have, animated series, you have merchandising, but even then.
Also the figurines.
Yeah, recently, like a few years ago, but for instance, the t-shirts.
No.
Like I don't think you can buy a Zero Calcare t-shirt.
Too bad.
I think it's too small a market for that kind of thing. I mean,
yeah.
Like, even when they try to capitalize on the popularity of Italian comics, I mean, I probably the most successful example of that is, again, Zero Calcare, but he's on Netflix, right? But when, you would think that doing an adaptation of Tex or Dylan Dog would be money in the bank. Total failure. The few attempts are total bombs. Even when, Bonelli was sort of constantly announcing the birth of, what do they call it? Bonelli?
Yeah, the Bonelli Cinematic Universe, I think.
Yeah.
With Dampier. Yeah, Bonelli is actually a fascinating case study in failure.
In how not to do it, exactly.
They've been trying to get this Bonelli Cinematic Universe starting for years.
And I think to some extent it's a matter of marketing and resources.
Yeah, I don't know.
Is there? I don't know, maybe.
I don't know if it's the products that were bad or.
We were talking 2 days ago about Dell'Amore, which is not an adaptation of Dylan Dog.
Yeah.
That was a masterpiece.
It is that, and it's.
Yeah, but like the Gemmas Diabolic, they are like cult, but they didn't.
It'd be like if the Marvel universe was reduced to Howard the Duck. It exists. It has its own cult following, but it's.
I think the most successful example is the Diabolic trilogy.
Yeah.
Which still lost a lot of steam.
Diabolic is, to me saying, is a masterpiece.
Baba
the Mighty Brothers are.
Mighty Brothers, but the first
is
one.
The third one?
Jinko, no, Diabolic Kisei, I think that's the third one. The first one, it had promise, like it got some attention, and then.
But so we still got the text is always at the center. That's what I meant. My question. We always go back to that.
Yeah.
While in manga, instead the text sometimes is in appendix as albums. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Not such a thing in Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
Which is the way you do it as well.
Yeah.
No one ever wants to look like text, so it's like.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not sure if it's a problem of the quality of these products or just something about the
industry. Yes.
Yeah, but also because the Italian industry, the Italian comic producers are very, very protective of these intellectual properties. So they tend to they are very cautious about give someone else permission to use their characters, and when they do, they put a lot of like paletti. So, for instance, the Manetti Bros Diabolic was very faithful, or was meant to be very faithful to the character. So you can't have much creative liberty, and so it's very hard to create a product that can on its own right with these conditions.
So in it, so that's like fan fiction is impossible to make. It's not.
It is, yeah.
Okay, that makes